Good morning or good afternoon, whatever time you're logging in. Please read along with me. This is just to give you some support because this is informational, more difficult text. So I'm giving you this support, but I expect you to also be reading with me. So lesson 2, how does a historian work? Okay. Knowing how historians work help us understand information, okay? So what is the evidence? Think about the guiding question. What types of evidence do historians use to understand the past? So think about that as we're reading. Historians ask questions about the information they find from the past. Why did some nations go to war? How were the people affected by that war? How did events of the past change people's lives? These questions help us focus on historical problems. To learn the answers to the historical questions, historians look for evidence. Evidence is something that shows proof or an indication that something is true. Evidence could be in the form of material objects such as soldiers' uniforms or scraps of pottery from an archaeological dig. Other evidence may appear in documents or written materials that were created during a historical event. Historians may use the evidence they read in historical sources to interpret what happened in the past. Primary and secondary sources. Historians look for clues about the past in primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are first-hand pieces of evidence. They were written or created by the people who saw or experienced an event. Primary sources include letters, diaries, or government records, literature or artwork from a particular time. A place is a primary source. Spoken interviews and objects such as tools or clothing are also primary sources. Primary sources help historians learn what people were thinking while the events took place. They use the sources to find evidence that explains historical events. Historians also use secondary sources. Secondary sources are created after an event. They are created by people who were not part of the historical event. The information in secondary source is often based on primary sources. Examples of secondary sources are biographies, encyclopedias, history books, and textbooks. A secondary source contains background information. Secondary sources also offer a broad view of an event. However, a historian may use primary sources to find new evidence about a subject. Reliable sources. Suppose you were studying the history of England and you wanted to know how ancient people lived. You might look in a book called the Domesday Book. This book was created in AD 1086 by administrators under William I. The book is a primary source from the period. It contains information about the people of England at the time it was written. Okay, so that's picture. Let's look at this. These sculptures of warriors are evidence of life in China during the Qin dynasty. They give archaeologists and historians information about China's culture and its first emperor. The Domesday Book is a long list of manors and the names of their owners. It includes details about how many workers worked the land. It lists the number of fish ponds, mills, and animals owned by each person. It also estimates the value of each property. The historian's job is to analyze and interpret the information from primary sources. They consider where and when a source was created. They also look for the reasons that the source was created. Was it a secret letter? Was it a document created for the king, such as the Domesday Book? Was it written so that all the people in the town and country would read it? So if you look, let's make a connection to today. They make a connection here. So they show you these maps up here, and they can be primary sources. The map on the left was created around AD 1500. Okay, think about how it compares to modern world maps, and that would be on the right is the modern world map. Okay, and think about what they can learn by comparing the two. In AD 1086, King William of England decided to collect information about the land and people in his country. Today, our government collects similar data every 10 years in the U.S. Census. Questions in the census do not include details about mills and animals, as in the Doomsday Book. They instead focus on age, race, and living arrangements. The census information is a primary source about the people who live in the United States. So, interestingly enough, we just got our census. Your parents probably did, and I know I did. I did my census this year, and it just asks how many people live in your house, where everyone's from, the race, that kind of thing. What is point of view? And those of you in my reading class, we were doing point of view in reading also. This is a little bit different. Historians interpret the document and the reasons it was created. They form an opinion about whether the source is trustworthy and reliable in its facts. This step is important since each source was written with a particular point of view or general attitude about people or life. The authors of primary sources use their points of view to decide what information is important and what to include in the document. Historians evaluate primary source to find its point of view. They decide if it's a trustworthy point of view. Sometimes a point of view is expressed as a bias or an unreasoned emotional judgment about people and events. Sources with bias cannot always be trusted. So if there's a lot of emotion that an author is using and not a lot of facts, it's not necessarily a trustworthy point of view. They're trying to convince you. So it's always a better when the point of view, if they're using facts to convince you rather than emotions. Okay, we will discuss this, work on the critical thinking questions to support what we just read, and we will definitely work a lot more on this when I see you in class.